The wooden boards of those ships we called druckers weren't polished mahogany or anything like that. Let's stop right there. There was axe mark upon axe mark, the scent of resin mixed with salt water, and the blood of a rower whose blisters had burst and stuck right to the wood. Now, how do I know? Of course, I'm a Viking, if you believe that, because I got it from an AI. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you about Hollywood's glossy Vikings whose hair looks like it just stepped out of a shampoo commercial. No, shout out to Erling Haaland here. Well, maybe I actually like Haaland. There are no "we fight for Thor today" vibes. The guy has a toothache. It's 800 and something, and the poor bastard groaned all night from a dental abscess. In the morning, he has to get up and row for 8 hours with a dull axe. So of course, I have the nerve to drag it out and say things like subscribe, hit the notification bell. Please do subscribe. Now, diving straight into the topic, what was really going through the mind of the first man who set out into that freezing North Sea? Was it the love of God, or the fact that the household dried fish stock had run out? History isn't made of fairy tales. In fairy tales, kings sit on golden thrones, princesses sit in pink towers letting down their hair, and real heroes like me fight dragons. But in Scandinavia, things were different. There were no towers there. There was rock, ice, and wind. People lived in stone houses with dirt floors, side by side with their animals. You step outside, it's a frozen chunk of land. You step inside, it's a smoky, eye-burning darkness. Life conditions like these can turn a person into a ruthless wolf. They chose this path because they had no other choice. That's why they looked at the sea and asked, what lies beyond this? The first ones to take a step were probably looked at as crazy, outcasts of the village. But when that first madman pushed his ship into the water and cut through those waves, those who followed realized it was a matter of survival. This geography turned them into the very sharks of that ocean. Instead of remaining trapped among those steep cliffs, challenging giant waves became their only way out. Where did these men come from? The geography we call Scandinavia wasn't the prosperous, peacefully furnished place it is today. It's rocky, barren, where the ground can't be dug and the base is solid granite. You try to farm, you hit stone. You try to raise livestock, winter lasts 6 months and the animals starve inside. These guys were backed into a corner. Either they stayed there and slowly starved to death, or they took to the sea. Now, they didn't have compasses or modern maps. What else do you think they looked at in the middle of the ocean to find their way? The position of the sun, the flight path of birds, and the color of the water. If the ocean color turns darker, it means you're getting close to land. But getting close to land could sometimes mean angry locals running toward you on the shore with spears. Their arrivals were hardly ever a walk in the park. Most of the time, they were hitting the shore with soaked clothes and frozen fingers. The dried meat they brought along might have gone bad, and their water might have grown moss. When they set foot on shore, the first thing they did wasn't to sip a calm coffee and discuss foreign policy with the local king. Don't believe that either. The main thing they did was check their swords and axes, because they knew the people here wouldn't greet them like guests. A mutual survival war was just beginning. The fjords these men lived in were narrow, deep water channels where the sea pierced the land like a knife. This geography naturally makes a person a sailor. Going anywhere else by land is nearly impossible. Mountains stand like insurmountable walls. Therefore, the only way to travel, trade, or even visit the neighboring village is by boat. A child learns to row just as they learn to walk. Battling the waves was in their blood because there was no other way they could feed themselves in those narrow valleys. When the calendars showed June of the year 793, things were pretty calm on the island of Lindisfarne on the east coast of England. Though that could be a topic for another video. Whatever. The monks were saying their prayers in the monastery, minding their own business, hurting nobody. Then those dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon. To the Vikings, that place wasn't some sanctuary. It was just a defenseless warehouse full of gold. Was raiding a defenseless monastery and slaughtering defenseless people a war to them, or just like shopping at a cheap supermarket? They went inside, gathered everything of value. They threw monks who showed resistance into the sea, or something like that. This event is the turning point of European history. Because these raids, which until then were viewed as the wrath of the gods, were actually the beginning of a systematic looting economy. The monks were terrified because, according to the mentality of the era, the house of God could not be touched. But the Vikings didn't listen to anything. In their religion, even the gods were mortal. For them, the concept of sacredness perhaps began right where the shining gold and silver were. This raid sent shockwaves across Europe. At the time, monasteries weren't just places of worship, they were also the region's banks and libraries. All the wealth was gathered there because, in their view, nobody could be foolish enough to rob the house of God. The Vikings broke that rule. For them, there was no such thing as a place protected by the gods. Any place that couldn't be defended deserved to be taken. This mindset would become the nightmare of all coastal Europe in the centuries to follow. The sole reason these men were so successful at sea wasn't just that they were fearless, that technology was revolutionary. The ships they called drakers were light enough to navigate shallow rivers and flexible enough to brave open ocean waves. They weren't made of a single piece of oak. The planks were overlapped and riveted together so that when a wave hit, the ship would flex instead of break. Were those terrifying wooden dragon heads at the prow of the ships really to scare away sea monsters or to mess with the enemy's psychology? Or maybe it was purely for decoration. Come on, don't always look for a war or psychological edge. Maybe the guy was just bored and said, "Let my ship have a dragon motif on the front," and they made it that way. But most likely, it was psychological warfare. The moment you saw that head from the opposite shore, your legs would start shaking. I mean, imagine you're peacefully farming on an island in your country and you see a dragon head appearing from across the water. Viewed from afar, they look like monsters gliding over the sea. The biggest advantage of these ships was that they didn't need a port to land. They could beach themselves directly onto the sand from shallow waters. The warriors inside could leap ashore and turn everything upside down before anyone even realized who they were. Building these ships required great craftsmanship. Finding the right tree in the forest, hewing it with axes into wooden planks, and fastening them together with iron rivets was a months-long process. Each ship was designed almost like an organism. Thanks to the flexibility of the plants, they could glide over the tops of waves without breaking in the harsh storms of the ocean. The masters used secret techniques passed down from generation to generation while building these ships. As in every war, these groups had front-line, high-headed berserk units. These men were called berserkers. They wore wolf or bear pelts, big their shields. Now, don't ask where this info comes from. I don't know either. The shield-biting part might even be a joke or real. Whether they could feel pain is still debated. Some say they lost themselves by eating mushrooms, while others call it a pure psychological trance state. Were these men really fighting with supernatural power, or were they history's first recorded professional adrenaline junkies? When the battle was over, neither the enemy nor rational thought remained. They might have even harmed their own men sometimes. That's why they were kept separate even within the army. Nobody wanted to stay in the same tent with them, you could say, because details in sagas about the social positions and behavior patterns of berserkers show they were generally viewed as outcast, feared, and ominous figures. So much so that during battle, they would lose themselves to the point of being unable to tell friend from foe. This made them both a terrifying weapon and a dangerous hazard that was hard to control for their own side. The sources of that era write that these warriors bit their shields and threw themselves into the front lines wearing only animal pelts without any armor. For the opposing side, fighting these people was very different from fighting an ordinary soldier. You had madmen who believed they carried the wolf spirit, feared death not one bit, and felt no pain. This psychological advantage was perhaps enough to dissolve enemy armies before swords even clashed. Media always showed us Vikings as blood-drinking savages throwing wine feasts out of skull cups. Of course they looted, of course they burned, but at the same time, they were master traders. They traveled down the Volga River all the way to Constantinople, today's Istanbul, and traded with Byzantium. They exchanged silk, silver, and spices. Have you ever heard of the giant-sized axe-wielding Varangian guards on duty over the walls of Istanbul? They were none other than these Vikings. While Byzantine emperors didn't even trust their own people, they chose these northern mercenaries as their most trusted guards. Because as long as you paid them, they were loyal and didn't care about anyone's internal politics. politics. What mattered to them was doing their job, filling their pockets with gold, and returning home. These trade routes didn't just provide material exchange, they also allowed different cultures to get to know each other. A merchant setting out from the icy lands of the north carried the mysterious treasures of the east, Arab coins, and Byzantine silks back to his village. This created a multi-layered wealth and vision in Scandinavian society. They weren't just men swinging swords, they were merchants utilizing one of the widest geographical networks of the era. What about the women? Do you think they just sat at home spinning wool? In Viking society, women's legal rights were more advanced compared to the rest of Europe at the time. They had the right to divorce, could acquire property, and while the husband was away on a military or trade expedition, the woman was the master of the farm, the fields, and even the entire trade network. Did you know about those legendary female warriors who, when necessary, picked up an axe and shared a shoulder on the shield wall alongside their husbands? In grave excavations, the bones of female warriors buried with swords, spears, and battle axes are quite numerous. While the head of the household was away on an expedition, the authority and security inside were maintained entirely by women. When necessary, they knew how to draw a bow, use a knife, and pull weapons against an enemy to protect the home. This situation made women's place in society quite strong. Even in a male-oriented war society, women were the core engine keeping life and economy running in the background. Legally, they could defend their rights in court and inherit a share, which was nearly impossible in the Europe of that era. The harshness of the social structure forced women to be just as resilient as men. Odin, Thor, Loki. Completely forget that friendly Thor you know from Marvel movies. That Thor was a red-bearded, angry, savage giant hunter who thought of nothing else than dropping a sledgehammer on heads. To go to Valhalla, dying in battle was a must. The soul of a Viking who died in bed from illness or old age went to the cold, dark, and gloomy pit of Helheim, which to them was the greatest shame in life. Of course, this is according to their beliefs. Everyone has their own religion. I am a Muslim. Praise be to God. Could this death culture have been the biggest brainwashing tool that ensured they didn't take a single step back on the battlefield? Definitely. Fighting a man who doesn't fear death and even views death as an honored ticket is the hardest job in the world. The guy is already programmed to die, saying either victory or Valhalla. This belief system was the most fundamental element legitimizing the hardships of daily life, freezing cold, and the ruthless savagery of war. This mythological universe was tailor-made to explain humanity's struggle with nature. Storms came because Thor swung his hammer, winter came with Loki's tricks. Therefore, every event in nature carried a sacred meaning, making people tougher, blah blah. Just between us, I wonder how they made all these up. Fear was replaced by a fatalistic yet recklessly brave acceptance. The year is 845. Erling Haaland is not even born yet. A massive Viking fleet led by Ragnar Lothbrok or ruthless leaders like him entered the waters of the same. Target: Paris. Frankish King Charles was so terrified that he agreed to pay the men tons of silver and gold so they wouldn't burn and sack the city. Instead of conquering a city, cutting tribute by saying, "Give me money and I'll leave." Wasn't that the most profitable business model of the early Middle Ages? The men took Paris, put the money in their pockets, and left. A few years later, they came back. The Franks saw this had no end and eventually gave them the Normandy region, saying, "Go live here and at least stop the other Vikings." This strategy was a massive move that radically changed the political map of Europe. These raids didn't just collect loot, they also exposed the weaknesses of kingdoms. When local rulers couldn't protect the peasants, people began to look after themselves, which laid the groundwork for the strengthening of feudalism. The Vikings, on the other hand, grew rich on the ransoms they took and laid the foundations of their own kingdoms. They knew how to bargain just as cleverly as they knew how to fight. Space got tight, population grew, lands ran out. First they went to Iceland, where they established one of the world's first parliaments. From there they moved to Greenland. A notoriously quarrelsome and cunning man named Eric the Red gave this ice-covered island the name Greenland so people would come and settle. A true medieval real estate agent. Do you know who that mysterious Viking explorer was? Who set foot on North American shores about 500 years before Christopher Columbus? Leif Erikson. The small settlement they established on the shores of Newfoundland in Canada still stands today archaeologically. Because they didn't get along with the locals and their numbers were few, they couldn't stay permanently on that continent, but they wrote their names among the first in history. These discoveries proved once again how brave and borderless sailors they were. Crossing the massive, fatal waves of the Atlantic Ocean in small wooden boats was an achievement pushing the limits of human reason. They built new worlds with the animals, supplies, and families they brought along. Every new piece of land became a new page in their struggle for survival. Setting sail into the unknown wasn't just an adventure for them, but a mandatory lifestyle. Like everything, the Viking Age didn't last forever either. Holland is still around, that's different. But Christianity spread rapidly to the north. Instead of multiple gods, they began to believe in a monotheistic religion. Kingdoms became centralized, and the era of "let's board a ship and loot the neighboring country" closed. Local kings began collecting taxes and establishing regular armies. Did you know that the last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada, not Harland, Harold, was killed by an arrow to the neck at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England in 1066? That battle was the official closing declaration of the Viking Age. Those old free raiders were now ordinary subjects of regular kingdoms. Free-spirited warriors were giving way to tax-paying peasants and lords loyal to kings. The wheel of history continued to turn. No power remained the same forever. When they stepped off those ships and onto land, the landscape they encountered wasn't just monasteries full of gold. The peasants living there were children of a geography just as harsh as theirs, yet they were shocked by the speed and ruthlessness of the Vikings. War didn't end with just swinging a sword. The return journey itself was a nightmare. When they stuffed the goods, silver, and captives they looted into those narrow drakkar ships and set out into the ocean, sometimes they couldn't set foot on land for months. Can you imagine what a man caught in a storm in the middle of the ocean, whose hands were torn from rowing and whose eyes were blinded by salt water, was thinking at that moment? They were thinking of their hearths at home, their children, and perhaps those steep mountains they might never see again. Because when one of those ships capsized, there were no life jackets or modern rescue teams. If the ocean swallows you, game over.
That's precisely where the concept of an honorable death in Viking culture came from. Dying in a storm at sea or on the battlefield rather than in a bed on the shore was the highest virtue. To say this men's daily life consisted solely of fighting would be a lie. In those short periods of peace when they were home, they farmed, fished, forged iron, and most importantly, told sagas. They gathered around the fire to listen to stories of past heroes and monsters. These stories were their only unwritten library passed down to future generations. Poets called skulls turned the deeds of kings and warriors into poetry, ensuring history was not forgotten. What do you think was the greatest legacy left to their children by such a harsh and ruthless society? Fearlessness or an innovative spirit of discovery? Neither. The greatest legacy they left is the rawest proof of how humanity can overcome seemingly impossible geographical and physical obstacles. Those people, who seem savage to us looking from today, were actually the greatest borderless pioneers of their era. They neither trapped themselves in a geography nor surrendered to their fate. They changed every place they went, but most of all they changed themselves. The wealth of the East, the civilization of the South, and the lands of the West met their turbulent waves. And even after this era closed, they left an indelible mark. Conclusion: what remained? Some of the words that passed into English today originate from that northern language. At the end of the day, they weren't Hollywood's polished heroes, nor were they mere monsters. They were people cornered by climate, geography, and the conditions of the era, and driven into the sea. They attacked to survive, traded to enrich themselves, and made their mark on history. Of course, not all of them did it for war or other reasons. There were bound to be those blinded by greed, turned into pirates, who took pleasure in killing and looting. We can't generalize. Now you tell me, what does the story of these men, who turned world history upside down with just an iron axe and a wooden shield, tell us sitting at today's comfortable tables?
It shows what a human being can risk when cornered and with nothing left to lose. The real story lying behind those cold seas and rusted axes is precisely this. Neither a fairy tale nor a myth, a pure, raw, and ruthless survival story. Maybe Vikings will be an inspiration to some of you, while to others they might seem like cruel, ruthless plunderers. It's necessary to listen to every perspective. Don't forget to state your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Hoping to see you in the next video. Goodbye.